one time was asked to present about our best program to senior level managers. So I prepared some slides that I thought were telling a great story, and I didn't stop to think about my audience. And my audience, our senior level, leadership team, they started asking me a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. And I was mortified. I was hurt and embarrassed. But when I reflect back on it, they weren't questioning me. They wanted more data. I didn't think, what questions might my audience have, about this data I'm sharing or about this presentation. Will they want that extra level of detail? Because I don't want it. I didn't stop to think my audience will want that data. I want to know that next level of detail.
Welcome back to the Frontline Leadership Podcast, where we help frontline leaders become professional leaders and transform business bottom lines in the process. I'm your host, Craig Coyle, former Apache helicopter pilot, aerospace leader, and founder of Operation Leap. And today, we have a special guest to share with you, my good friend, Cindy Darnell. Cindy is a certified DISC consultant. She's a John Maxwell certified trainer, speaker, and coach. And she's also a Lean Six Sigma Greenbelt. She has over 25 years of experience in the testing, inspection, and certification industry, where she's created some incredible results through the processes she's transformed and the teams that she has empowered. But her true passion focuses on igniting emerging leaders, helping them lean into their strengths, discover their passions, and boldly step into the best version of themselves. I really enjoyed the conversation that I had with Cindy, and I'm really excited to share it with you all today. So without further ado, here it is. Well, Cindy, welcome to the Frontline Leadership Podcast. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we were talking a little bit before we hit record about why this episode, it was the perfect next step in everything that the Frontline Leadership Podcast has been leading up to at this point. The last few episodes, and really what we've been doing is we've been sitting inside this concept I call the ground school pillar of the Lead Like a Pilot framework, which is, what are the things that we need to talk about with new leaders to help set them up for success for what the world of leadership looks like? And in the last few episodes, we talked about things like self-leadership. How do you lead yourself, and how does that show up in how you lead others? Or emotional intelligence and the tenets of that, which are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and then obviously relational management. And that leads perfectly into the topic we're going to talk about today, which is personality and temperaments. And I think these are great tools that we can use not only to better understand ourselves, which is probably the most important use for them, but to better understand others and then how we can relate with them given what we know about ourselves. I first came into this world, I was involved in a mastermind group. And the first book I read that was associated with any of this stuff, it was Personality Plus by Florence Littauer, and it broke things down into essentially the 4 temperaments. And if I remember, it's like sanguine, which is kind of your extroverted kind of people person, a choleric, which is kind of like your military leader, right? Your hard charger. Your melancholy, which is kind of like your perfectionist, if you will. And then the introverts, the more kind of reserved, laid back type folks as well. So anyways, that's my background with this kind of stuff. It's changed my life, changed how I kind of see who I am and how I see the world. I'm curious, I know you're involved in the DISC community, but how did you come into this whole world of personalities and temperaments in the first place?
Yeah, so gosh, several years ago, I love all of the assessments, right? DISC, Myers-Briggs, Clifton Strength, you name them. I've taken them all because I love learning about myself. I love learning about others. And I would say, probably at least 10 to maybe even 15 years ago at this point, was really when I took my first DISC assessment.
Yeah.
And it just really resonated with me a lot at that time. I was a mid-level manager. I had, 12 or so direct reports, and it just really helped me in my career, helped me grow. And yeah, I love it.
That's great. Yeah, it's amazing how much these tools can allow you to learn about yourself more than you like could ever really have known beforehand. I'm curious, like when it comes to the idea of personality frameworks, these tools as a whole, given your experience, I mean, you are a practitioner in the manufacturing space. You work in the continuous improvement world. You have experience with these assessments, these tools, and everything. Like, why do you think they matter? And especially within the context of like the work happening on the front lines. Like, why do you think these tools are so important?
Yeah, so I'm part of the John Maxwell leadership team, and one of John Maxwell's famous sayings is you have to know yourself to grow yourself.
That's right.
So, for starters, if you want to continue to grow and evolve as a leader and be successful, you have to know yourself. And for supervisors, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts and your posts on LinkedIn, and how do we set our supervisors up for success in that way?
Yeah.
Well, this is a great tool to start with, right? How better to start off a supervisor with equipping them with some knowledge about themselves and their leadership style, their communication preferences. With DISC, it talks a lot about your strengths, your weaknesses, your motivators, your fears, and so you really go, deep in those levels to learn about yourself. And when you're leading others, that's critical, right?
It's so crucial. I remember when I was growing up in the military doesn't really talk about this stuff too much in its development circles. And, obviously when you think about how Hollywood has portrayed the military, and really the military has portrayed itself this way too, there's really one clear archetype of a leader that's kind of promoted in that world, right? It's the hard charger, the loud talker, right? Kind of the drill sergeant, if you will.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the model that we're given in the military, at least, of what a good leader looks like. And it wasn't until I came across this world that I realized, well, no, anybody can be a good leader as long as they understand who they are, as long as they understand who the people they're leading are, and they understand how to relate effectively within the confines of those relationships. And I think it was when I realized that I was trying to be somebody else because that's what I thought I had to be as a leader, that I
Yeah.
finally started to unlock my potential as a leader in the military itself. I'm curious, like, I know we kind of have a similar personality. Did you have a kind of similar experience with these types of tools?
Yeah, so what's interesting for me is I've worked at the same company for 26 years, and it's in the testing industry, and I'm surrounded by highly educated PhD level chemists, metallurgical engineers, mechanical engineers, and that is the opposite of me for sure. But early in my career, I thought I needed to strengthen that side of me to be successful
Right.
and to be a manager and to be a leader. And through DISC and learning, yes, those are, weaker areas for me. But if I focus on those, that's just going to lead to frustration. So if I focus on my strengths and what I bring to the table, that is opposite of a lot of folks I work with, but that's a good thing, right? And knowing when I interact with those folks, they will come from a different perspective. So how can I better change my communication to work with them? And that was a big turning moment for me in my
Yeah.
career because I was spending a lot of time very frustrated in I've got to strengthen these more technical skills. Now I see things so much differently, and it's been a lot better for me.
Yeah.
I've found much more enjoyment in approaching it that way and leaning into my strengths than trying to fix, maybe
Yeah.
things that are weak areas.
I totally agree. It's like one, you start leaning into what feels right for you, which makes everything easier. But then two, you understand how other people, given their temperaments and personalities, how they're going to receive stuff, and you cater kind of how you approach different situations with that in mind. And then you're more confident because you're you're more confident because you have a good idea of how it's going to be received. You're not doubting whether or not the message is going to land, or the hard conversation is going to have the impact, the positive impact it needs to have. So that's great. So I think that's the perfect point now in the conversation, really start getting into the nitty gritty of how some of this works. Now, there are a ton of tools out there. I mentioned Personality Plus, or things like Myers-Briggs. I think you mentioned the Enneagram as another great one that's gained a lot of popularity. StrengthsFinder is a great tool. I think the five love languages fits into this. A lot of times that gets pigeonholed into like marriage type stuff, but marriage is leadership, right? And communication, and this stuff applies to that as well. Obviously, today we're going to talk specifically about DISC, and you're an expert in that. So within the confines of using DISC to know yourself first, we'll start there. Can you just give us a brief overview of kind of how it works, and maybe how it's helped you better understand who you are?
Yeah, with the DISC assessment, there's a few things to consider. People will ask, do I think about my work self or my at home self? Because those could be different sometimes. And my answer is always, well, just be consistent, right? So when you're taking that type of assessment, if you have your work hat on, just answer in that same way throughout. Or if you want to, have a personal hat on, just be consistent, right? So that your results reflect accurately at the end. And what I love about the Maxwell method of DISC, which is what I'm certified in, there's a section of that assessment that is about your leadership skills compared to the 7 characteristics that John Maxwell says makes up a good leader. And
Right.
so there's a big piece of the report that actually kind of tells you, where do you fall? Are you average, below average, above average in these 7 characteristics?
Right.
And so when you're really thinking about leadership, those traits that make up a good leader, at least in Maxwell's opinion, how do you stack up, and where are your strengths in those leadership characteristics, which is great. But for me, it was also your fears, because you don't realize sometimes when you're reacting to a situation or to change, to confrontation, it's coming from a place of fear.
Mm.
And I didn't really realize that until I went through the DISC assessment and became a consultant myself, how much our fears really play into how we respond and how we react. And that was really meaningful to me.
That's great. Yeah. So can you maybe break down what DISC kind of the assessment does, and how it categorizes personalities, and maybe give an example of kind of what you are?
Yeah, sure. So, if you're not familiar with the DISC acronym, so there's 4 quadrants or 4 personality styles, right? So D is dominant, I is influencing, S is steady, and C is compliant. And so it's kind of based on kind of 2 characteristics initially, right? So if you're more outgoing personality style or more reserved, and kind of if you're more people focused or task focused, those are kind of I would say the edges of the
Yeah.
DISC quadrant. And what's important is everyone is a blend of all 4 of these, right? So it's not, if you're a D or an I, whatever, that's all you are. That's how you will always act, or how all you will always behave, because that's not true. We definitely know that. So I am an IS. So I'm a I'm a high I, and S is my secondary. So IS is my DISC result. So I'm an influencing, high people person, high energy, fast paced worker, and outgoing people person.
Yeah.
And that is opposite, like I was saying earlier, to you. A lot of the
Yeah.
coworkers I've had for many years are more facts focused, analytical, and slower paced workers. So,
Yeah.
um,
It's
yeah.
so interesting. I mean, that's a great bridge for like the difference between personalities and temperaments, because I think we have a similar temperament, I would argue. But when you think about the personality side of things, I am very task focused. And I probably fall into that category with the engineering background, the pilot background, the process focused background. So that's so funny. Another thing that you kind of hinted on that I think is so important, especially in the world of all these different tools that you can use in the personality temperament framework. So many people I feel like sometimes take these assessments and then they kind of pigeonhole themselves into thinking like this is who they are, like this is all they can be, XYZ. And I think it's really important. You kind of talked about how everybody's a unique blend of the four disc categories. I think it's so important to realize that these are just tools. They're not like an indictment on who you are and who you have to be all the time. Like everybody is a unique human being. These are just tools to help you be more aware of how you operate, what your tendencies are, what your natural strengths and weaknesses might be, so that whenever you're in the world, whatever you're experiencing, you can be more aware of who you are so you can better relate to the people around you. Which is the perfect segue. We just talked about how you can use DISC to help better understand who you are. How can you use DISC to help better understand the people around you? And why is it so important to use it beyond yourself?
Yeah. So, of course, anytime you're working with people, you can kind of pick up on behaviors and personality styles. But when you actually go through a DISC assessment, and my favorite thing to do is in person workshops, because then you really get to see the aha moments and
Yeah, yeah,
you do role playing exercises, and people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that's how I come across to you, and that's the best because it is a real light bulb moment for a lot of people who have never, taken this type of assessment or have never really stopped to learn about themselves or about their peers, their coworkers or their team. And so it just really helps with so many things. But I would say, just communication and connection, right? And understanding that, in times of stress, we lean more into our natural tendencies. And so sometimes our strengths can become a weakness at that point because we revert back to that and we lean into it heavier. And just that knowledge alone and knowing when, supervisors and managers, we're in intense situations a lot, right? The pressure is on. Got to get
right.
production out. We've got all these things happening. Stress is high a lot. And so learning that, I'm stressed out. I'm reverting back. I'm leaning more into maybe it's if I'm a dominant person, maybe I'm really coming across poorly to my colleagues or to my
Right.
teammates, and how do I kind of reel that back in and speak their language?
Yeah. Can you think of, and it's okay if you can't, but can you think of any times where either you can reflect back on your career and think, man, I wish I knew DISC in that moment, or maybe sometime since you've learned about DISC when you're like, man, I'm so thankful I had that because it totally changed how the old version of me maybe would have approached that situation.
Yeah, so I think about this situation quite a bit. So I one time was asked to present about our 5S program to senior level managers.
Yeah.
And we already said I'm not a facts, detail, analytical person, right?
Right.
So I prepared some slides that I thought were telling a great story, and I didn't stop to think about my audience. And
Uh,
my audience are senior level, leadership team. And in my presentation, they started asking me a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. And I was mortified, right? I was hurt and embarrassed. But when I reflect back on it, they weren't questioning me. They wanted more data. And I didn't think to prepare. I didn't think what questions might my audience have about this data I'm sharing or about this
yeah.
presentation. Will they want that extra level of detail? Because I don't want it. I don't care. What
Yeah.
I didn't stop to think my audience will want that data.
Yeah.
They'll want to know that next level of detail. So I would have handled it a lot differently now, right?
Yeah.
And I do. I have those meetings a lot now, and I do handle it differently. But at the time, I was just mortified. And I just thought it was, it was me, it was personal, and it really wasn't, right? It was
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
data.
That reminds me so much of the 5 love languages, because obviously in each of those, it talks about how we always tend to communicate our love in the way we prefer to receive it. But a lot of like,
Mhm.
I'm a words of affirmation person, like 100,000%, right? Um, and thankfully my wife is too, so that helps us quite a bit, right? But most relationships aren't like that. And like I consider myself a very poor gift giver. And so, obviously, like, I feel like everybody enjoys receiving gifts, and we're always blown away by someone who's really good at it. But yeah, that idea of, like, the way you feel when someone communicates love to you in the way that you speak it is so different from how you feel when it's communicated in a way that you just don't, it's almost like a foreign language, you don't fully understand it. For me, the one period of my career where I think, man, I wish I knew more about personalities and temperaments. Obviously I'm much more introverted, much more melancholy, much more task focused, and I am definitely a conflict avoider as well. That's probably been my biggest challenge in leadership. And when I my first real leadership position in the army, my kind of secondhand man, if you will. I was a platoon leader at the time. So my platoon sergeant, 20-year career, Apache maintainer, was this 6'5" Jamaican, just hard charger, right? Like the example, former drill sergeant, instructor for maintainers. And this guy was like, conflict was his life. Like he belonged in the military. And thankfully, we were on the same page most of the time. But there were a few times where I was just dreading having to go talk to him about something that I felt we needed to course correct on, and I think so much of that dread and the avoidance and the anxiety that came with it was ultimately just a result of a little bit of me not fully understanding myself and my weaknesses and my strengths, but then also not fully understanding just the way he was wired, you know?
Mhm.
And so this is such a great tool, and I love that you shared and opened into that communication piece, because that's where a lot of this type of internal EQ personality work really, it lays the foundation for us to be really, really good communicators. And I think for manufacturers and really any operations heavy type listener, we tend, especially on the front lines where there's unfortunately not a ton of development, it seems like most supervisors tend to communicate in the way that they prefer, right? In the way that feels natural to them. So the question I have for you is, what do you think's the most common mismatch in communication between the sender and the receiver in these types of environments? And what do you think is the most important thing to do in terms of like addressing that in a meaningful way that produces lasting change?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times communication around change
Mm,
is so mishandled, right? Because people react to change differently. We know that. But
yeah,
a lot of times it's because there's a fear that we haven't taken care of, right? So whether it's fear of loss of security, fear of loss of control,
yeah,
fear of stability, whatever, when we're communicating change, we haven't answered that question for those individuals. And so when they appear that they don't want to change or they don't like change or they're dragging their feet, some people use that old acronym cave dwellers, right? The people that won't get on board with the change.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
probably because we have not, when we're communicating about it, we have not answered the question they have. And they may not feel comfortable asking that question.
yeah,
So, as a leader, our job is to really figure out, okay, they aren't on board, but there's a reason. And what is that? And have I addressed that fear? Or it's that fear, right? It's so important. And I mean, gosh, we're all human. We all make mistakes. I've missed the mark tons of times in my career, but
oh yeah,
knowing, just taking that time to think about, okay, why are they not on board, and how can I address that? because usually it's something we have not answered as part of that change process.
And that goes into a conversation that's adjacent to this one, and we've talked about it on previous episodes, but it's so important whether this is for the senior leaders out there, it's also for the leaders that you guys lead. I mean, it is so important that as managers, we have margin in our schedules. Now, that's not margin just so we can show up and have time to firefight all day. It's margin so we can show up and be present, not just for the sake of being present, but for the sake of being able to truly get to know and understand our people and think intentionally about how we're going to go about communicating with them and understanding the things, just like you said, Cindy, that maybe aren't being directly said to us, but we can see them and we can hear them if we're able to be present, if we're able to be around it. That's not possible when you're running around all day like a chicken with its head cut off, like 99% of
Right.
frontline leaders are. So it's obviously like this is possible when it fits into a framework and in an environment that lays the groundwork and allows things like this to be conducive. So, which is a perfect segue into the last question I have for you, Cindy. What do you think good looks like when you think about DISC, when you think about personalities, when you think about emotional intelligence in general? Like what does good look like? And maybe what does that look like on a manufacturing floor?
Yeah. So I think first with the supervisor, knowing about themselves and making small adjustments may not be noticeable at first, but it might be, when you have one-on-ones with your direct reports, when you're in, a team meeting, adjusting your communication style to the individuals that you're meeting with, and just seeing how much better connection you have with that individual, better communication, how much they respond to you in a better, more positive way, right? But then I think the next level to me is the team, right? And intentionally flexing your approach in conflict, right? When there's a tense situation happening, when you've got to resolve a conflict, it can be so impactful. And well, I said earlier, I love doing workshops with the whole team, and start with the supervisor, but once you get the whole team together, and one of the things I love to do is we have this big wheel of disc with all the different combinations of D, I, S, and C,
Yeah.
and I love to have the team, take a little post-it note and go up and put where do they fall in that wheel. And when you can see how diverse your team is and like, oh, you know, Joe's just like me. Oh, Stacy,
Yeah.
she's totally opposite than me, like it just is so enlightening and so helpful.
Yeah.
And you will see your success compound, right?
Yeah.
Just it's so important.
Yeah, and even too, you start to realize, do I have the right people doing the right things based off what they're naturally inclined to do, right? And I think part of that comes into like, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do? But
Yeah.
sometimes even just the smallest tweaks, even on frontline teams with what people might be in charge of or what you might task people with as a secondary responsibility based off
Yeah.
some of these things we learn about ourselves can totally change the dynamic. And when we change those dynamics, we change our culture. When we change our culture, people become more engaged. When people are more engaged, they're more loyal. When they're more loyal, everything starts to move the needle forward in our business.
Yeah, and we were talking about change earlier, and I'm a big fan of Gemba walks, right?
Yeah.
And going out on the shop floor and talking one on one and asking questions, being aware of your disc styles when you're doing that is so helpful.
Yeah.
And just like I said, it just compounds day after day, builds trust, and all those things. So
Yeah.
very
That's
helpful.
awesome. Well, Cindy, this has been a fantastic conversation. If people want to learn more about DISC, are there some resources that you think are a great place to start for folks?
Sure. If you Google DISC, there's a million DISC providers out there. Like I said earlier, I prefer the Maxwell method because that's what I'm a consultant in. But you can reach me on LinkedIn if you want to have a one-on-one conversation and talk to me about DISC, and I can help you with getting an assessment and debriefing you on your results. But yeah, there's loads of resources out there around DISC, and like I said, all the other assessments too. I mean, I find value in all of them because they all tell you a little different piece about yourself.
That's right. Yeah, they all have a place. And, it can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes if you're trying to do all of them at once. I think it is good to find the one that, read a book or two on each of them, figure out which one speaks most to you, start there and
Yeah.
see where that gets you and kind of take it from there. So, well, this has been a fun conversation. Cindy, any final words if anybody wants to stay in touch with you or kind of learn more about the work you're doing, whether that's with DISC or the work you do in your professional career as well? Any final parting words?
No, I would just say take the time to get to know yourself, and then get to know your team and whatever tool you choose to use, right? And just see the success that you'll have with that. And, I cannot put enough emphasis on that. I actually just did a lunch and learn yesterday on everyone communicates and few connect. And it's so important. And in today's world, I just think that human connection is just so important. So,
Yeah.
yeah, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I would love to, obviously I could talk 4 hours about DISC.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another great resource drop. The John Maxwell's book, Everyone Communicates, Few Connect. I mean, you could tell right off the bat, it is. I mean, that's exactly what we talked about today, right? The whole world's communicating, throwing signals out all the time. But the premise of communication is not just about what's being sent. It's about whether or not what's being sent is being received and how it's being received. And everything we talked about today is a tool to help leaders navigate the challenges behind that. So, well, Cindy, thanks so much for joining us today and looking forward to seeing how this conversation just impacts so many people that are listening.
Yeah. Thanks so much again, Craig. I appreciate it.
Well, what a great conversation. Cindy is so knowledgeable and passionate about this content, and I hope it provided some value to you within the context of the conversations we've been having. But look, understanding how you're wired and how your people are wired is only half of the equation. The other half is what you do with it. Because even the most self-aware supervisor, one who genuinely understands themselves and their team, can still fail at the most fundamental operational responsibility they have, telling their people clearly and consistently what's expected of them. And when that breaks down, everything downstream breaks with it. That's exactly what we are going to tackle next. But until then, I'm Craig Coyle, and this is the Frontline Leadership Podcast. Let's lead.